We're back here on our program, Jones and Company, and we are discussing what many Bahamians are talking about. Effective the 1st of July, value-added tax increased to 12%. Godfrey Ines?
Mr. Johnson, it seemed as if a great deal of your analysis is based on the last 10 years.
Right.
All right? And according to the IMF, the Bahamas was the only country in the region that saw no growth in its tourism. We now are seeing growth in the tourism sector.
Right.
What is your concern about this increase in VAT will do to our competitiveness?
It will have some impact, no question. Anytime you do anything to increase the cost, you're going to create some competitive issues. So part of the calculus as we look at it is really what is the implications of any particular move you have. You increase your tax, you decrease your tax, what are the ripple effects? It's impossible to say, and it would be unreasonable to suggest that there is no implication to this. But again, what the analysis that we, as those who charge, have to look at is also what the medium-term impact is of no action. See, the calculus comes down to this, Godfrey. It's you either make your adjustments now when it's manageable, or you have to make a more substantial adjustment later. If you take where our trending and interest rates, and let's say we decide to use the argument that 12% wasn't right, we either leave that alone and do nothing, or we increase it more manageable, let's say to 10%. What would be the implications of us doing that? And those are the scenarios that we would have run.
So you had to run a sensitivity analysis.
Exactly. So you would see, and one of the things that became very clear is that because our deficit is structural in nature, you either play forced with one or two alternatives. You either have to do a substantial contraction in spending, which invariably means laying off a considerable number of people, because that's really the only place you can do real cuts, and for them to be material. Or you're going to have to do a midterm correction that could be even higher because your interest payments come out before. So the notion was the midterm adjustment now, as painful as it may be, is much more preferred to a potentially more significant correction later.
So the government is amenable to a midterm correction?
Well, of course, all governments have to be, because of course if the situation shows that it's necessary, it is done. Now our analysis is predicated upon the point that we get the point that allows us to address the immediate needs. Because remember now, with this 12% still doesn't balance our budget. We still have a $237 million deficit that we're budgeting this year, and still another $100 million deficit next year. So it isn't fixing the deficit right away, but it gets us on a glide path to be able to deal with it.
What assurance do we have in the public that these calculations are right, Mr. Johnson? Because when VAT was introduced initially, I had the then financial secretary on the program.
Right.
And he mentioned that, we expect to get $250 million or thereabouts from VAT.
We got more.
We got $600 million from VAT.
Right.
So the Ministry of Finance had the numbers wrong.
Right. But one of the things that came out of that, and you would notice too, because as I'm sure you studied, is that we did not know what the size of our economy was, because for years our numbers were based on customs duties.
Yes.
And I think what VAT revealed, and this, remember now, a year and a half ago, the introduction of VAT led even the Department of Statistics to re-baseline our economy. We didn't know how big the economy was.
Right.
So I say that to say that now we have a much clearer sense of the size of the economy because of VAT, because VAT actually brought the service sector into the taxable bucket. So I think right now we have a little bit more confidence in the size of the economy.
Having said that, a major criticism of the government is that you didn't consult the business community.
Right.
That's one. Second, that you changed the formula.
Right.
You changed the model of value-added tax with the number of exemptions that you are giving. When we interviewed the consultants out of New Zealand on our program, see, Godfrey and I were involved in all of this over the years.
Right. VAT experts itself also.
Yeah, they told us that no exemptions, right? And that was agreed.
Right.
Now that you are giving all of these exemptions,
what does that mean?
What does that mean? Didn't you change the model?
Well, yes, of course. If you add an exemption, you change the whole landscape of that.
Yes.
But what we do is we costed out that. So we know, for instance, that from our estimates, about $40 million in exemptions would have been given. But that was part of the government's policy to try to cushion the impact to the most vulnerable. And that's a policy decision. So the calculus was, first of all, the government had made a policy commitment coming in that they were going to address the breadbasket items. But that became even more urgent given the need for us to expand the pie. So the government took the decision that, listen, notwithstanding, you're right, the sort of the prevailing wisdom that you minimize exemptions, and even with that, most countries, when you do the research, even including New Zealand, they still have exemptions on their VAT. The government took the decision that, listen, to cushion the impact of the most vulnerable segments, we will make some accommodation to it. And you're right, that's a policy decision, and it is debatable as to whether you will, instead of, if you took out that 40 million, you could have perhaps raised the VAT only to 11.5% as opposed to 12%.
But as a...
Yeah, but hold on one second. So why didn't you consult, though? Why didn't you consult the people, the coalition, that really put this whole thing together? Because they claim that in the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and the financial services sector, they got together and handed you this, and the government then agreed on it.
Well, that's a question you really got to put to the policymaker, because they're the ones who made the decision on consultation or not. I can say this, though.
But you were the financial secretary.
No, but I can say this. I can answer your question even more directly. I've been a part of budgets from 1991 to 2001, and again in 2018. And in all of my time, going back to Port Ladley, I never once, from any budget, did the government consult anybody on tax increases. The VAT, introduction of VAT was different because it was the introduction of a brand new tax, so that created some consultation. But outside of that, in my living memory, I don't ever remember government consulting anybody outside in respect. And we saw considerable tax increases in my first go round. Remember, when I started government, cars were at 35%, that's 65% now. So we've seen, there was no business license when I got into government. There was a business license put on all businesses in the Bahamas with zero consultation. So you can make the argument that yes, a government can consult or should consult, but that is truly a policy decision. But it has never been a feature of the Bahamas.
Yeah, but if you're changing the model and giving all of these exemptions, it seems to me that you ought to be courteous to the coalition.
That's an argument you can make with the policymakers, but I'd only say that in the context of the VAT, if we're collecting $1 billion worth of VAT and you have $40 million worth of concession giveaway, it is not a material sum in that context.
Okay.
All right.
Mr. Johnson, I think you find yourself in a precarious position sometimes, from the point of view that I was a political appointee.
Right.
All right. Are you a political appointee or a public servant?
I'm a public servant.
You're a public servant?
Yes.
I see. So you have to...
I straddle.
You have to rationalize.
So what I said, because you're right, it has gotten me into hot water.
Yes.
And it has drawn criticism. But what I've done, I've looked and see what my predecessors have done. I've looked and see what Mr. Wilson would have done. I've looked to see what
Mr. Smith.
John and the John Holt, the governor of the central bank, and the evidence is there that they went out. What the guidance I have is I try to speak to the government's policies. When I speak here, I'm speaking as to what the government's policy is. They are Marlon's views. It's to articulate what the government policy is and to sort of address technical questions. When there's a policy question like on consultation, I do have to deflect that to the policymakers. But what I have been told is that, notwithstanding that, people are appreciating the fact that me and whomever is going out and actually explaining the government policy positions. But these positions that I articulate are on mine. They're the government position. If the government changes tomorrow and I'm in the chair, I would do the same with respect to the government of the day.
Mr. Johnson, there is a view that the present policymakers should have taken their own advice that they had while they were in opposition. While in opposition, the current Minister of Finance was against value-added tax, as was the Prime Minister, who said that it was a lazy approach. And it could be said that it was a lazy approach now by the government of the Bahamas to increase to 12%, rather than seeking to grow the economy, to stimulate the economy, to grow the economy so that you can get more customs duties and all the rest of it. There is really very little in this budget, as I read it, about growing the economy organically so that you are able to collect more taxes rather than putting this burden on the average Bahamian.
So the I think you have to do both, and I think both are important. You have to both grow the economy, and you also have to close the fiscal gap. The challenge that, again, I go back to the reality that looking at the numbers technically is that as this exercise developed, the budget exercise, the government realized that it faced a fiscal gap of over $600 million and that was after going through the exercise of trimming down the budget, which is why when you look through the budget, you'll see that half the budget heads have less allocation this year than last year. So it went through the budget to try to trim down where it can. The other reality was that there were a number of allocations in the budget, and the one I use often is around the school lunches. The school lunch program cost $4 million a year, but it was budgeted at $2.5 million. The government of the Bahamas had about $9 million worth of IT development software contracts in service, which didn't show up anywhere in the budget. We added all that together, $70 million. We had $90 million more in customs duties. You had the $360 million in arrears, of which $172 million will be settled this particular fiscal year. Is that the reality was that had the government not taken the revenue measures, the alternative would have been to run another substantial deficit. A couple things happen when you do that. As I mentioned already, you now have a situation where you're going to have a substantial interest rate spike. Secondly, we've gone through 4 consecutive downgrades. The reason the credit rating agencies downgraded us, despite the fact that the sort of stability that we talk about, is the fact that in the view of the credit agencies, both Moody's and Standard & Poor's, that the government was not addressing this very precarious fiscal situation. And so, again, the backdrop against all this is recognizing that running bigger deficits would lead to substantial increase in interest, and could lead to another downgrade down the road, which again will cause the interest rate prices to hike. So there's a number of factors that, when you look at it, would have led the government to see that we had to do both the corrective action as well as the continued efforts to grow the economy.
Yeah, but how can you address the fiscal situation effectively when you had 2 major hurricanes back to back?
Right.
Joaquin in the eastern Bahamas, southeastern Bahamas, Matthew that damaged a whole lot of places, and then yes, all of these, which contributed to the deficit position that we find ourselves in. And in addition to that, our economy was not growing. Bahama didn't open. All right, now you have Bahama open. The Minister of Tourism is saying that we have record numbers now. And if we have record numbers from Bahama and other islands are growing, why didn't you leave the Bahamian taxpayer alone?
Because, Wendell, for the reason that I said, because we would have faced, even with the growing economy, even factoring the growing economy, we would have faced a $700 million deficit. That's the answer to your question. So the answer to your question is that even with the growing economy, because our deficit is structural, it means that it isn't just a cyclical deficit that the government had to deal with. It was a structural one. The other reality in the Bahamas, and this is the soft spot for Bahamians, is, as you would study this, and I invite you to go and take the research, our revenue to GDP, meaning our revenue collection and our input and our revenue tax structure, so even counting for the revenues we don't collect, puts us around 17% revenue to GDP. Our peers in the region is at 24%. Developed countries, 35, 40%. Our tax yield, because we are a low tax jurisdiction, has historically been low. What that would mean, again, you're talking about the credit agencies looking at us and what we do ourselves, is that our taxes historically have kept us in a deficit position because we haven't yielded enough to be able to cover our expenses. So the reality is this: we're into a growing economy. The economy turned the corner and is starting to grow. We have a structural deficit. We have had a doubling of our debt. My technical advice is one that's really, really straightforward. There's never an ideal time to raise tax, but if you want to raise tax, you want to raise tax during your expansion phase, as opposed to a situation where you tapped out your expansion and you're on the way down to try to put a tax, significant tax increase there.
And if you see a significant contraction of the economy of the Bahamas, people are going to blame you, you know.
Absolutely, and I understand that. So I don't take this lightly, and I'm sure the government doesn't take it lightly either, because I am the country's chief economist. I am the person who holds that. So if businesses are pulling back, If
and
businesses
you
follow-
see, and because there is a view by some economists that you're not going to hit your numbers,
Right.
that you're not going to get this $400 million
right.
that you believe that you're going to get,
Right.
because people are going to spend less, and
but-
there are going to be less investments. People are not going to buy properties.
But it didn't bear out the first time. When we've had, what people seem to forget is the first VAT was a much more significant increase in taxes than this current one. 7.5% is more than 4.5%. That's just math. So the impact to our economy during a sluggish, no growth economy, even putting VAT into place, the economy still grew better than it did the year before with 7.5% tax. Part of the reason why that is because increased government revenue means that vendors get paid on time, which means that they can circulate the money back in the economy faster. So we were projecting 2.4% growth. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't meet that number. And if there is a fall off, I'm almost confident that barring the unforeseen, barring that we don't have a hurricane or some other calamitous event, that we will continue to see positive growth. That is what we're projecting, and that's in the numbers, and we'll see certainly how it pans out.
Godfrey has a good question for you, but Godfrey, I do have to take this final break, and when we return, we'll come to Mr. Hines. We'll take this break, we'll come right back.